Okay, today my desire is to focus our attention on the next passage in our discussion, sort of looking at a few key prophetic texts. Obviously, we're not looking at all the prophetic texts. We would never finish, but I did want to focus our attention on a few of them, as I think they present some helpful insights into the major events, particularly in regards to the second coming. And that's what the focus of a lot of these passages have to do with, is around the time of the coming of Christ. And if you'll remember, there's, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of different views, different viewpoints regarding events that take place right before or right after the second coming. Most everyone, at least all genuine, believers and mainline evangelical, conservative denominations, all agree that in the second coming, Jesus is returning, and at some point, the issues surround, or the differences of opinion surround, is there a rapture tribulation before that coming? And there's disagreement about that. And then there's disagreement about after his coming. Does he come and then there's an actual literal kingdom where he reigns on earth, or do we enter in the eternal state? Those are some disagreements or disputes that I hope to cover maybe in a few weeks. We'll talk about some of those. I'm sure you're familiar with the different major eschatological systems. That is the different major views. There's amillennial, postmillennial, premillennial, historic premillennial. Those are the major camps when it comes to end times events. But every one of those camps, every one of those views agrees that Jesus is coming back. There is a literal second coming, but there's disagreement on some of the events surrounding that. And as a result, the hermeneutic that each of those groups uses differs, and that's how they come up with different interpretations for the prophetic text. So the point of view we have taken, the point of view I have taken and have been conveying to you men, is a literal, looking at passages first from a literal perspective. Assume literal unless something in the passage tells you not to, tells you that it's figurative or symbolic. That's the safest approach, I think. And I think we see that affirmed if you're to take all the prophecies about the first coming and then notice they all are fulfilled literally. So that, I think, gives a lot of support to, then we should assume the second coming prophecies are also going to be literally fulfilled. And also, too, remember, we've looked at some passages in the course of this whole module where we've seen a mix between the first and second coming. Like in the Old Testament prophets, they'll speak about the first coming, and then they'll talk about the second coming, and then sometimes they'll go back to the first coming, and there's this mixture. And so they speak about both events, and if the first coming, if those prophecies were literally fulfilled, certainly why should we not expect the second coming prophecies to be fulfilled literally? I mean, that's just basic basic hermeneutics. I believe in, to me anyway. I know many smart men have different opinions, but I think when it comes to interpreting prophetic text, we should start with a literal understanding and then allow the passage and the context to guide us if it is different, like we did when we looked at Daniel chapter 7, when we talked about that, the four beasts there, and it says that those beasts are not literal, they represent nations. So it's like, oh, okay. The passage tells us those beasts were symbols. So I think you'll find that more often than not. A lot of people, when they look at prophetic passages in the Bible, sometimes people seem to approach it very differently than they would another kind of passage in the Bible, that there's something mysterious or spiritual or secretive or cryptic or coded in these prophetic passages. And so they'll approach the interpretation like that. Now, certainly the prophetic texts have a lot of interesting and different things, you know, beasts and future events and cataclysmic events at times, but that should not move us to always think it's literal, symbol, or figurative and symbolic and spiritual in its interpretation. So that's the approach that I have taken, that I believe is most consistent in interpreting all of Scripture. Is you begin from a literal understanding, looking at the context, understanding the background, the setting of the passage, the flow of thought of the passage. So for prophecy, how does this prophecy fit into what the author has been saying? And so take that same approach and then allow the passage to help guide and direct you as far as whether or not there's a figurative or symbolic meaning to the text. And so that's what I've been looking at so far when we've been studying here. Our focus has been on, so far, we've looked at 3 passages in some detail the last several weeks. After the first couple of weeks, we looked at the theme of the kingdom of God in Scripture, and because of what the apostles were expecting when just before Jesus ascended, and they said, is it now you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And they just reflect a mindset that is consistent with what all of Scripture points to, is that there is this kingdom of God, this reign of the Messiah, or reign of God through the Messiah on earth that is coming. That's a major focus in Old Testament prophecy. It's all over the Gospels and in the book of Acts as well. And so that theme, that idea really permeates or is an umbrella to biblical prophecy. And so these passages we've been looking at, Daniel 9, Daniel 11 and 12, Zechariah 14, they all just emphasize, focus upon that return of the Messiah to establish his reign on earth. And prior to his return, there'll be this great tribulation. Daniel called it the 70th seven, if you'll remember. And he described that time. There would be this abomination of desolation that would take place when this one called the prince, that we know is referring to the Antichrist, the prince is going to carry out this abomination of desolation, whatever that is. And then Daniel 11 and 12 talks about, it transitions from the times just following the days of Daniel up to the Maccabean revolt, and then jumps forward in time to the end, the tribulation period in Daniel chapter 12, and describes events there. And then in Zechariah 14, we have probably the most detail of the second coming in the Old Testament, as it describes the feet of Yahweh, who we know to be a reference to Christ from Acts 1, the feet of Yahweh coming, landing upon the Mount of Olives, that is the specific geographical point that he will return to. Again, is that figurative? I read some commentators, they say, oh, the Mount of Olives represents the church, or the Mount of Olives represents, no, it's the literal Mount of Olives, the location. Again, it's referencing a specific place. There's nothing in the text that tells us it's a spiritual or figurative reference or symbolic. So we should expect that to be fulfilled literally. Just as Micah said that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem of Ephrathah, and that's what literally happened. So we should expect his second return, his second coming to earth, to actually be where the Bible predicts it, Zechariah 14, the Mount of Olives. So with that, in Zechariah 14, it describes that return. It describes him coming with the holy ones, waging war upon the enemies that have gathered, and then reigning from Jerusalem in the Messianic kingdom, that the Messiah would reign from Jerusalem, from the temple, because we know that from earlier passage in Zechariah. But Zechariah 14 gives all this detail, and it really is a reflection or a parallel to Revelation 19 in a lot of ways. Revelation 19 gives even more detail, that it is Jesus, that he'll be riding on a horse, that he will wage war as he comes. But those two chapters parallel one another, which is kind of interesting, that Zechariah 14 is one of the last chapters in the Old Testament, and it parallels Revelation 19, which is one of the last chapters in the New Testament. So there's an interesting, what do you call that? I forget the name of the term, but just that's interesting that we have that coincidence. Okay, now any questions on that? That's just sort of a brief review of what we've been talking about. Anyone have any questions? Have you been thought about those passages? Any questions come up in your minds in reflecting on those before we move forward?
Pastor Tim, about the Maccabean revolt, how do we know that that is the prophecy of Daniel 11:12? That's the event based fulfillment of what Daniel says, based history of Maccabean revolt. What do you mean? It fulfill literally the things that what Daniel prophesied.
Yeah, good question. If we didn't walk through all the details of the whole chapter, I just sort of gave you a general overview. But if you did that, it describes how there's the king of Greece, a reference to Alexander the Great, and that he will die and his kingdom will be split into 4 kingdoms. And that's exactly what happened. It was split into 4 kingdoms. And then those kingdoms, it talks about how others will rise up, and those are the Seleucids. They rise up and they rule in that area. They rule over Israel. And there'll be one of those kings, the king of the south, which actually Antiochus Epiphanes, the 4th, was this particular king, and how he will commit this abomination in the temple. And that's exactly what happened. And in fact, I don't remember if I mentioned this before. Daniel 11, if you were to track all the details that it mentions and compare it to history, to what actually happened, it's so accurate that many liberal scholars say that it could not have been written by Daniel. That they say it's too accurate. There's no way someone could predict these events so accurately. It must have been written after the events happened. Right? So they don't believe, liberal scholars don't believe in, miracles, don't believe in this kind of thing. And so they try to explain it away and just say that Daniel 11 could not have been written by Daniel. In fact, they say most of the book couldn't have been written by him anyway, but especially Daniel 11. That chapter receives a lot of attacks from liberal scholars because I believe it is so accurate in how it predicted those particular events. And so basically, if you were to go and study the history of that period, Kent, and just follow the rulers that came out of after Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, and then just compare it to what Daniel 11 says, you really can see a lot of specifics that are fulfilled. I didn't go through all those details because I didn't want to cover that time period closely. I really wanted to focus on the end, the tribulation period there. But I did refer to Daniel 11 because there was an event called the Abomination of Desolation that did take place historically in the time of the Maccabean revolt. Now, it doesn't mention the Maccabees there in Daniel 11. There's no reference to them because, but you can read about them in the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. It's an apocryphal book, but it describes the history of Israel between testaments, basically, focusing on that period with Antiochus Epiphanes. So it's worth reading. It's helpful history. It's not inspired, but I think a lot of it is probably accurate or close to accurate. So that'll give you some idea. But yeah, I think right around toward the end of chapter 11 is when you see this transition from that time period to the next abomination of desolation, which will take place in the tribulation. And I think that's the connection. So I didn't want you to be confused if you were reading Daniel 11 and you say, wait a minute, here's an abomination of desolation, and it sounds like it already happened. Or it happened. So is that the same one that Daniel 9:27 refers to? And it isn't. They're two separate ones. And how we know that is the one, Daniel 9:27 refers to an abomination of desolation that takes place in the 70th week of Daniel. And that is not what's being described in Daniel 11. So long answer to a short question, but did that answer your question, Kent? Or
Yes,
is there...
yes, yes. Actually, I saw an articles, study notes actually in Maccabean Revolt.
Yeah, actually, I would, encourage you guys to read 1st and 2nd Maccabees. It is the Apocrypha, so I'm not saying it's part of the Bible, but I've studied it and read it, and I found it, a lot of it, to be helpful. Some of it's really boring. It's like a history book, but it actually has a lot of helpful information, and it gives all the details behind Hanukkah and the whole reason there's Hanukkah and the celebration of that, and who the Maccabees were. They're an important group in Israel's history, and certainly some of the things they did had an effect and an impact on things that we see in the New Testament among the Jews of the time of days of Christ. Part of it being the temple. If you remember, at some point I described the layout of the temple in Jesus's day. You remember, and it has the different courts. Did we talk about that at some point? I think, like Herod's temple, right? It has the court of Gentiles, and then the court of men, the court of women, the court of priests. Well, yeah. In the original temple, actually the tabernacle that was designed by God, given to Moses, there were only two courts. There was the court of the priests, or the inner court, where you'd offer the sacrifice, and then there was the outer court. This is where you would wait before offering a sacrifice. So people would wait there, and then when you were going to give a sacrifice, you would go into the inner court with the priest. And that's the same design that Solomon used to build the first temple in Jerusalem. There was an inner court and an outer court. And then when Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple in the days of Zechariah, because the Romans had destroyed it, or the Babylonians had destroyed it, there was, again, just an inner court and an outer court. So sometime between the days of Zechariah and the days of Jesus, additional courts were added in the temple. And those weren't biblical. That wasn't mandated by God. These were added by the Jews. And I believe it was the result of, the best I can tell, is as a result of that Maccabean revolt, they were so angry with the Gentiles that they formed these additional courts to restrict Gentiles from entry. And that wasn't ordained by God. That was something that they did. And so I think, reading that part of history can be helpful to get an understanding of the mentality and the mindset of the Jews in the days of Christ.
Well, Pastor Tim, I hear that you give the background in Ephesians 2, verse 11 to 13.
Yes. That's when I talked about it. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, exactly. They built that wall, right? Remember if I showed
dividing wall between Jews.
Yeah, the dividing wall. Let's see let me I'm just going to show you guys. And I know we already looked at this before, so just humor me a little bit here. I'll just what's a good picture here?
Ako am nang wali sa epistles. Ken, ako ang assignment.
What's that?
Divide natin mo. That's my assignment in the book of epistles. Dividing the world between the Jews and the Gentiles.
Yeah, the I thought I remember seeing a good picture of this before. Okay, maybe this one. Can you guys see this all right? It's a picture, kind of a cartoon.
Yes. Yes.
Right, this is this big area. Okay, of course, here's the holy place, and then the Holy of Holies is the back half here, right? Actually, I have yeah. So right here's the holy place, and then this part here is the Holy of Holies, right? And then out here, this big court, right, is the court of the Gentiles. Okay, so anybody could go here. And then notice, guys, do you see this wall here? This little short wall? That is where no Gentile could pass that wall to go into. And then here's the court of the, and here's the court of women, and the court, then the court of men, and then this is the court of the priests in here. But this particular wall that goes all the way around, there were these, notice there's these entry points here. All right. And there was a little sign next to each entry point that said, you know, no Gentiles allowed to pass at the threat of his own life, basically. So they were saying, you can't come in here, we'll kill you. Well, this design layout of the courts is not God's original intent. His original intent was, and we could just see that with Solomon's temple. Let's see, how do I clear? See, that's not correct. Oh. Give me a second, guys. Let me find an accurate layout here. Yeah, these are all Herod's temple. Let's do the tabernacle. Maybe this one? No. Trying to find a good picture of the ones that just shows the two courts. But all these are is this one? Yeah. Picture's blurry. Let me see if I can. Yeah, so this would be like Solomon's temple, where notice there's just this inner court here, and here's the altar. It's hard to see, it's blurry. And then this would be the outer court just outside the wall there. So you would go in to offer your sacrifice. This is probably a better depiction of the Solomon's temple. So sorry to digress here, but all of that to say basically that the book of Maccabees, you know, describes the events and the situation and the desecration of the temple, which I believe led to the Jews in the days of the Maccabees to then put in these additional courts to restrict the Gentiles from going in. And so I think I got off on that whole point just to encourage you guys that I think reading the first and second Maccabees would be a helpful resource for you, and just treat it like an historical book. Don't treat it like the Bible. It's not inspired, but it does have helpful historical information that I think would be useful and to you. But also too, it was prompted by an Abomination of Desolation, Antiochus Epiphanes, making pagan sacrifices in the temple, was what then the Maccabeans got, the Jews at that time got so angry with that's why they revolted. The Lord allowed them to have victory in that. All right, so Zechariah, any other questions? Apologize for the long digression. You know me by now. I tend to do that, don't I? So let's jump to the next passage then. Speaking of Jesus and the temple, that's where we find ourselves in Matthew 24 during Christ's last week on earth before his crucifixion. He is in Jerusalem. And on this particular day, Matthew 24, Jesus and the disciples are in the temple area. So I'm going to ask Pastor Emil if you could read Matthew 24, verses 1 to 3. We're just going to go through most of the chapter together, and I'll just point out a few highlights as I've done in previous passages. But Pastor Emil, can you read verses 1 to 3?
In Matthew 24, 1 and 3. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?"
All right. Well, here's a few interesting things. So this gives us sort of the setting. And again, remember, as with in the next verses, he's going to tell of future events. Okay, he's going to prophesy. But remember, we never just look at the prophecy by itself. We always have to see what's the context here. What prompted the mention of the prophecy? What brought about? Why did Jesus start talking about the future? Well, you can't skip verses 1 to 3 because they give us the setting, and they'll tell us why. So, Pastor Emil, since you read this, let me just ask you first, what is the setting here? Where are they? Can you kind of summarize those 3 verses for us? Are you still there? Ramil, did we lose you? All right, anyone else? What do we
Yes,
see here? Yeah, Ken.
Jesus from
Jesus.
going from the temple and going out from the temple and far away, and he point out the temple buildings. And he said to his disciples who follow him, "Did you see all these things?" So the stone, I will say to you, not one stone will left another. So, and now as he point out, Jesus is in the Mount of Olives setting.
Yeah, exactly. So they're coming out from the temple. So they're walking. Oh wait, Sandy, did you have something?
I think Jesus was in the sitting opposite to the temple.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm going to pull up a picture here, if I can. Some that we were looking at last week. So let's see. Let me change let's see, maybe here. Okay, this is a picture looking at the Temple Mount. Obviously, this is the Dome of the Rock. This is not the temple. This is the mosque that's there now. But you see the ancient wall here. right? Along the, and the trees here, that's the base of the Mount of Olives. So if we're to look at it from another angle, we're looking at view of the Mount of Olives from the temple. What? No. Okay, so here's looking at it from the other direction. All right, so this is sort of the Mount of Olives here. There's buildings and graves on it, things. Here you see the Dome of the Rock, this direction. All right, so they're coming out of the temple, and they're coming along, you know, this direction, and then go up the Mount of Olives here. And so Jesus makes the comment as they leave the temple, right, that this building's going to be wiped out. Okay, and we know that's a reference to the Roman destruction. And then they go up to the Temple Mount area, which in those days was just a Mount of Olives, sorry, it was just a grove, an olive tree grove. And which is interesting, right? Because guys, remember, where is Jesus going to return from? Or to, sorry? Come from heaven to the Mount of Olives, interestingly enough. So here he's sitting at the Mount of Olives, and he's asked a question about his return, which we know from Zechariah is going to be at that very spot. Anyway, it's kind of a little bit of an irony there. And so it's important we understand this. So they're leaving the temple, and the disciples, right, they're pointing out the temple buildings to him. And, you know, I think in another gospel, they're describing how wonderful they are, how amazing they are. And then Jesus says, look, these buildings, the temple is going to be destroyed. And then they continue their walk for a little further up to the Mount of Olives. And that's where Jesus sits down. And then the disciples ask him these questions. And notice there's a key word here. You guys see that word privately?
Yes.
This is a conversation that's going to take place between just the disciples and Jesus. All right, that's an important detail that we need to remember here. All right, so it's just Jesus and his disciples. They've just come out of the temple. Jesus has predicted its destruction. And then they're thinking about this, right? So they're walking along and they get up to the Mount of Olives, and then the disciples finally ask him, okay, when exactly is that going to happen? Like you just said a few minutes ago, the temple is going to be destroyed. So they have this question, but actually they have three questions. You guys see that? There's three parts to their question here.
Tell us, will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming?
At the end of the age.
Yes, that's exactly right. There's three questions here that they're asking, right? When will, and notice it says, they said, when will these things happen? What things? What did Jesus just talked about?
Second coming, destruction of
The
the temple.
temple.
The destruction of the temple, right?
Destruction, yes.
Okay, and then they ask a second question. What will be the sign
What will be the sign?
of your coming? Okay, and then a third question, and it's implied, what will be the sign
Of the end.
of the end of the age? Okay, so they're asking three questions here, not just
Pastor
one.
Tim,
Yeah.
Pastor Tim, I have question in verse 2. Can you roll up back to verse 2, please?
Yeah, let me
Because
do this.
there is a willing wall now, and the Jews believe that this is part of the temple, but Jesus said, not one of the stone out of this temple. Jesus said, you will show these things, and there will be left here one stone upon another that will be thrown. is Jesus telling it literally or just figuratively?
Yeah,
When he
that's,
said not
I
one.
think that's an idiomatic expression that it'll be destroyed. It'll be ruined.
That's an idiomatic expression, not
Yeah, I think
literally.
so. That's how I understand it.
Because there is now a willing wall that the Jews are believing that is the part of the temples.
Well, but actually, though, as I think about it, Sandy, that's part of the wall, but it's not part of the actual original temple.
What kind of wall?
It's just
The
the wall that was the eastern wall that surrounded the temple.
Okay.
Okay,
So
so I
Jesus
think
said,
the actual temple is completely gone.
actually,
But
so
the,
follow-up question for the team.
yeah, go ahead.
So Jesus mean here is the temple buildings, not the wall.
I believe, yeah, I think so. It can be either way, all right, because there is sort of an expression that was been used in those days, you know, not one stone upon another. It's kind of an idiom for complete destruction. But I think actually in the case of the temple building itself, the building itself was complete, the holy place was completely destroyed. And then all that was left is the Wailing Wall, which was the eastern wall of the temple.
Thank you, Pastor Tim. Thank you.
Yeah,
Was it
no, that's a good question. That's a good question.
Pastor Tim, my second question is with this question,
Yeah,
in verse 2, what will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming? How come the disciples thinking about these things, these questions? They have idea what will happen in the because of the prophecy of the Old Testament?
yeah, I mean, that's a good question too. Like what I mean, obviously their initial question makes sense, right? When they're saying when will these things happen? So they're like, okay, geez, you just predicted a pretty significant event. The temple's going to be destroyed. When's that going to happen? And they would, I guess they're recognizing that that's going to be a significant event and certainly would have something to do with his return. Because remember again, what would they have known from Old Testament prophecy? What did we just talk about in Zechariah 14? That in the end times, the enemies will surround Jerusalem and will attack. Okay, so if they're thinking about, you know, Zechariah 14 or even some of the other passages, but especially Zechariah 14, perhaps they would understand then if the temple's destroyed, that must have some connection to, you know, when the kingdom comes, because there's going to be the battle against all the enemies that surround Jerusalem. So, you know, maybe they made that connection in their minds. They don't tell us explicitly, but certainly on the mind of every Jew is the Messiah is going to reign and he's going to kick out the Romans, right? That he's going to beat God's enemies. That's certainly in their minds. So perhaps they're recognizing the understanding or the events of Zechariah 14, that in some way this temple destruction is going to be part of when the Messiah comes and defeats God's enemies who have attacked Jerusalem. So that would be my guess. We're not told directly here why they make that connection, but that's something I don't think is unreasonable for them to consider. Anybody else have any thoughts or ideas about that? What might have prompted them to then ask about his coming and the end of the age? And again, remember, in their mentality, in their mindset, they're not thinking about, okay, Jesus is going to die, rise again, go, you know, ascend to heaven and come back later. Okay? They're not thinking that way. Even in Acts chapter 1, they weren't thinking that way. So certainly here they would not be. They would probably be seeing this as this idea of your coming. They would be seeing as the presentation and exaltation of the Messiah, who, when he defeats the enemies and reigns in Jerusalem. That's how they would understand his coming. Any other thoughts or questions or comments about that? It makes sense, I hope.
Yes, Pastor Tim.
Okay, Pastor Tim. Yes.
Okay, good, good. Okay, so the important thing I wanted you to gather from this is just note the 3 questions, because I believe, and this is my view on this chapter, is that how Jesus responds really directly answers those 3 questions. And that's how we can see the structure of this chapter. That first, Jesus answers the first question: when will the temple be destroyed? And then he answers the question of the events leading up to his second coming, and then the second coming itself. I'll show you that and why as we go through here. Eric, let me ask if you could read verses 4 to 14 here.
Yes, Pastor Tim. And Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place. But that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many, because lawlessness is increased. Most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves now, what is he referring to here? What event or events is he speaking of? It sounds like
The
end.
signs of the times.
Yeah, he talks about the signs, that these are signs that to come. And the question is, and this is where people debate, is he talking here about the second coming? Is he talking about the tribulation? Some argue this is the first half of the tribulation he's talking about. Others argue it's the second half. Or some say that actually he's referring here to the destruction of the temple. Okay, so this is an interesting question to think about. What is it? Right? Well, again, remember, what is he doing here? He's answering these 3 questions from the disciples, right?
Yes.
Okay, so is he going to ignore? He could, but do you think he's going to ignore this first question? When will these things happen? Well, what are these things? The these refers to the destruction of the temple. I think he's answering that question first. Okay, now why do I say that? Well, 1, just because that's how he begins, but 2, notice, again, who is he speaking to? Who is the them here in this passage? The disciples. Now notice the pronouns. Remember, one of the steps in your exegetical process is to do textual observations. And in that step, you're supposed to look for pronouns and identify who they refer to. Well, here's a good example of why that's important to do. Okay. See to it that no one misleads
You.
you.
You, the
All
disciples.
right.
Disciples again.
Yes. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you are not frightened. For nation will rise against nation, but in all these things, bird plague, then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you. And you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Did these things happen to the disciples, by the way?
Yeah,
Yes.
not yet.
Yes. Many false prophets will arise. Okay, so I think he's speaking here of the destruction of the temple for a couple reasons. One, that's the first question they ask. And so it would seem logical Jesus would answer that first, especially when you read the rest. The rest of this seems is not directed to the disciples, and I'll show you why in a few minutes. And then again, notice we said earlier, he's speaking privately to the disciples. Okay, nobody else is around. It's just them sitting on the, he's sitting in the Mount of Olives. They're gathered around him. They've asked him these three questions. And so he begins. His first response is, he answered and said to them, see to it no one misleads you. So he's going to talk about here events taking place in their lifetime. Okay? Because he's saying you. And he warns them in verse 9, you'll be delivered over to tribulation, and you'll be killed, and you'll be hated, which is exactly what happened to all but one of the disciples, right? John was the only one who was not martyred. The rest of them were, all right? And several of them survived through the 70 AD, by the way. All right, so I believe that it's referring to disciples here, and as a result then, and it's the same thing, by the way, that was mentioned in the parallel texts in Mark and Luke, which you can look up and I'll put in your notes, where he tells them again, be on your guard. Again, he's speaking to this is a parallel passage in Mark. They will deliver you to the courts and you will be flogged. So he gives more detail. Mark describes more detail than Matthew chose to put in his gospel. You will stand before governors and kings. All right. When they arrest you and hand you over, don't be afraid about, right? Again, this whole part, I believe, he's speaking directly to the disciples about events taking place in their lifetime. Okay. Same thing in Luke. He gives those details. And then notice in verse 14, he transitions in time. All right. He tells them in verse 13, endure, all right? And then verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. All right, so he's speaking, verse 14 is really the gap of time between the destruction of the temple and the tribulation. Just like the Old Testament prophets, right? Jesus is skipping this whole thousands of years basically here. In verse 14, he jumps from, I believe, verse 14, he jumps from 70 AD, the destruction of the temple that's described in verses 4 to 12, or we can say 13. And then he goes to the tribulation period, which we'll see in a minute. All right, remember, that's exactly what happened in Daniel 11 to Daniel 12, right? To the same jump. And that's exactly what happened in Daniel 9:26 to 9:27. Or was it 9:25 to 26? I don't remember. There's this jump from the first coming to the second coming. Okay, so this is not unusual for a prophet to be speaking of one time period and then jump to another in the far future, especially jumping to the messianic, the second coming. All right, which is exactly what Jesus does. I mean, he's answering their questions. When will these things happen? Well, let me tell you, fellas, things are going to get bad. It's going to get bad. In those days when the temple is destroyed, there's going to be false Christs. In this time period, you're going to be persecuted. And remember, it was around 67, 68, 69 AD when Peter was martyred, when Paul was martyred. Several of the apostles were killed because Nero and subsequent Caesars were increased their persecution. So these things happen. All right. So he's warning them. He's saying, look, at this period of time, you're going to be persecuted, but endure. And then he jumps to another period of time of great upheaval that's connected to the destruction of the temple. And that is, I believe, the tribulation period. All right. And that's what we'll read about next. Any questions on this so far? Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. It gives you something to think about at least. I know there's different perspectives on this, but I'm just presenting to you the view that I've taken. Again, sort of going back to Jesus's original question, or the disciples' original questions that Jesus is now answering. Okay.
Pastor Tim.
Yeah. Yeah,
Pastor
Eric.
Tim. Maybe I think the reason why they think that this is a tribulation period because in verse 9, there's the word tribulation.
Yeah, they refer to that. They will deliver you to tribulation. That word tribulation just means affliction. So
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
it's not the tribulation, but it will be a tribulation for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not
Because
great
again,
tribulation, Pastor Tim.
say Sandy, what's that?
That tribulations. Today we have a tribulations, but that is not peripheral to the Jacob's trouble, which is the great tribulation.
Right. And in fact, because later Jesus in verse 21 says there will be a great tribulation, and he's speaking there of the actual tribulation. So he makes a distinction himself in verse 21. The verse 9 tribulation is the specific affliction that the disciples are going to experience. Because again, notice it says they will deliver you. That's not speaking generally to everybody. He's talking to his disciples here.
Not the
Okay?
believers all times.
Because here, guys, is a key. Again, always look at narrator comments. Remember, I told you that when we studied narratives? Well, here's a great example in verse 15. Right? When Jesus transitions, now he's moved forward in time to the tribulation, right? Because he's referring to the abomination of desolation, spoken by Daniel the prophet. Okay, now we're in Daniel's 70th week. And notice he makes, the narrator, Matthew in this case, makes a comment. Do you see that? Let the reader understand.
Pastor Tim,
Huh?
the word let the readers understand, that is really original written if we go back to the Hebrew writing, or just a comments of the interpreter
Translation.
when translated.
Yeah, that's something Matthew put in.
So in the Hebrew writings, it was already there.
Well, yeah, and this was written in Greek, right? It's the New Testament. Jesus is not quoting the Daniel passage. He's just referring to it. Right? He says, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel. So he's not quoting an actual text. He's just referring to that event that Daniel spoke of. So Jesus is speaking here in the red, the red words. But then notice Matthew inserts a comment in the middle of Jesus's dialogue where he says, let the reader understand. Jesus didn't say that. Matthew did. Do you know why he said that?
Why?
Because now the focus is not to the disciples. Now he's speaking of a future time. So in verses 4 to 14, that was directed to the disciples, right? Remember the you, the pronouns? But verse 15 and on is now speaking of events far future to the disciples. And so Matthew's saying, let the reader understand, because it's now us, right? We're reading this So he intended for the reader to recognize, okay, Jesus talked about some events specific to the disciples that already happened. But now, reader, you need to understand and listen up, because what Jesus is about to say is going to potentially could affect you. It could be in your generation. You guys understand what I'm saying?
Yes, Pastor Tim.
I think this little comment is very important. The narrator is telling us that now we are no longer looking at what applies to the disciples specifically. Now we're looking at events that could apply to the reader or someone later in time relative to Matthew. All right, because again, Matthew wrote this gospel, people estimate maybe in the 50s, so maybe 20, 25 years after Jesus's ascension. All right, so these words that Matthew records are words that Jesus spoke 20 or 25 years earlier. Now he's writing them down, and now he's saying, he's giving us a clue that from verse 15 and on, this is something we need to pay attention to, because these are events that could take place in our time or in our near future. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to ask, let's see, Emmanuel, can you read verses 15 to 21 here from Matthew?
15 to 21.
Yeah, and then Jesse, you able to read where you're at? I'd like you to read 22 to 28 if you can. Go ahead, Emmanuel, verses 15 to 21, please.
Okay, Matthew 14:15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will.
All right, Jesse.
Unless those days had not been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner room, do not believe him. For just as the lighting comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, the vultures will gather.
Okay, so now it's getting into some serious events here. All right, and I believe, based on what I was just talking about, that these events I believe they refer to the tribulation period, particularly the second half. Now, why would I say that? What clues do we have in the text that tell us we're speaking of the tribulation?
Abomination of desolation.
What's that, Jesse?
The abomination of desolation.
Yeah, verse 15, right? The abomination of desolation
In the book of Daniel.
in Daniel, all right? And we know that
Daniel 9,
that verse is Daniel 9:27, right?
7.
And we know that is in the middle of the 70th seven. Okay? The middle of the tribulation. All right. What else tells us we're talking about the tribulation period? Anything else Jesus said specifically?
The end of 3.5 years. Second part.
Yeah, this is the second half. Is there anything in Jesus's statement here that tells us that also confirms that we're in the tribulation? He's talking about the tribulation, the big tribulation.
Verse 21.
Yeah, verse
21,
21, right? A great tribulation, and notice he describes it, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Okay? Like this is the greatest one. So certainly, what's that, Sandy?
The question is, what is that event?
Yeah, and we know from Daniel, right, that Daniel speaks of, you even referred to this earlier, Sandy, right? Daniel, was it 12? Where Daniel described, again, there's a jump in time to the tribulation. There will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. Okay, so here Jesus is referring to the great tribulation, the big one. And of course, we know now with the book of Revelation at our disposal that that's what he's talking about. But Jesus here, Matthew 24, is speaking of the tribulation period, all right, especially, particularly the last half. And again, notice the you here now is different. It's not the disciples, it's the reader.
It's the third person.
Yeah, it's the you is now the reader, because Matthew makes that clear here when he says, let the reader understand. Okay, so I think Matthew gives us an important clue that we're talking here not about past event, or not about the destruction of the temple. We're now talking about something in the future that's future to that. And the you is now not the disciples, but it's that rhetorical you, right? It's not the disciples specifically. It is the reader that Matthew recognizes is the person that needs to be paying attention. All right. Because the abomination of desolation did not happen in the days of the disciples, and it hasn't happened yet. The one spoken of by Daniel is going to happen in the future during the 70th seven, the tribulation period. Okay? And then he says in this time period, there's going to be many false Christs that rise up. But none of them are the actual Christ, because he says the Son of Man is going to come like lightning. Okay, which again, if we go to Revelation 19, it's going to be this worldwide cataclysmic event when he comes out of the sky. And that then transitions from the Great Tribulation. And now the last few verses here, verses 29 to 31, are a reference to the second coming, which will bring in the end of the age. Again, remember the disciples' questions. When will the temple be destroyed? When will your coming be? So and then when's the end of the age? All right. And the end of the age, at least that this present age, will be at the second coming. That's when all of his enemies will be destroyed. He'll set up a kingdom in Jerusalem that will usher in a new age. Okay. So he's describing here now, I believe, verses 4 to 14. If we go back to his questions. Let me just do this. Okay, verses when will these things happen? That, I believe, is verses 4 to 13, basically. And then he asks, when will what will be the sign of your coming? All right, what will be the sign of your coming? All right, so what's going to precede your coming? What will precede? That's verses
14 to
15,
21.
28.
15 to 21, 28.
And then what will be the sign of the end of the age? All right, that's
29.
verses 29 to 31. Okay, when Jesus returns. Okay. Sandy, have you read yet?
What verse?
Can you read 29 to 31?
But immediately after the tribulations of these days, the sun will be darkened. Now it was in the Revelation, I think. And the
Yeah.
moon will not be give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken. And the signs of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Chapter 19 in the book of Revelations. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and with glory. Hallelujah. And he will send forth angels, rapture, with the great trumpet. They will gather together his elect from the four winds and from one end to the sky to the other.
And then, so this is, what event does this refer to?
Second coming.
Second coming.
And coming.
And how do we know that? Couple things. One, it says, you will see the Son of Man coming. Well, that's a pretty, I mean, there it is. All right. How do we know it's the second coming? Because it says
Very
it's
obvious.
the coming. Okay. But notice it says immediately, as I told you before, when you study prophecy, look carefully for time references. Okay. Notice there's another one at verse 29. We saw one time reference back up in verse 14, then the end will come. All right. So that's a switch. Now he's skipping to the end. By end, he means, you know, the events right before the second coming. Right. And then he mentions in verse 15, the specific event, Abomination of Desolation. So that pinpoints it right in the middle of the tribulation. Okay. Then in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation, that's a time reference. So now the tribulation, at the end of it, there's going to be this huge cataclysmic event in nature, and the Son of Man will appear. All right. And then the events surrounding that. Okay. So here, just by paying attention to the time references, by paying attention to, as Matthew puts this little narrator comment in that helps us understand the transition from speaking to the disciples about events in their time to events in the future. All right. So those are key details that I believe help direct and guide us to see that this is really the structure here of this passage, that verses 4 to, we could say 14, he's speaking of the destruction of the temple. Verse 14, he transitions to the end times, and we see specifically at what point in the end times in verse 15, the abomination of desolation in the period of the Great Tribulation. And then verse 29, the transition right after the tribulation. Okay, you see those time markers, guys? That's very important to understanding this passage. Well, any prophetic text, but in this one in particular, I think many people conflate all these verses, and they say, well, all of it, it's really all verses 4 to 31 really all refer to the second coming. Is what some some interpreters say. But I say no, because you have to look and note the time markers in the text. You have to pay attention to what's the setting. What prompted Jesus to speak? Well, those three questions from the disciples in a private conversation. And so I think, again, these verses in the beginning are a reference to them in their time period. So this speaks of the days when the Romans destroyed the temple. And then he transitions to the tribulation period, and then transitions to the end of the tribulation period, which is the second coming. Okay?
Okay.
And then he says the elect will be gathered. I believe he's speaking there. Some would say, well, that's the rapture. I would say, no, that's actually likely the elect being gathered to enter into the millennial kingdom. But we'll discuss that when we talk about Revelation.
Yeah, Pastor Tim, because I heard someone that the rapture will take place at the coming Christ because of this verse, elect gathered from the province. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's a possibility. It's but we don't have enough information from the text here to say, well, which elect is he talking about? The dead elect or the living elect? Right? I think it's the living. The dead elect would then that would be the rapture. But if it's the living elect, that's not a rapture. He's just gathering them together. All right.
Pastor Tim, because this word elect also was found in, I think, in Revelation chapter 6. That word, I think, I'm not sure, but I also, because there's a synonymous of this verse, that God will send his angels and gathered in the four winds and gathered the elect. I think it's in chapter 6 in the book. I could not get the exact chapter or verse, but I passed read that word.
Yeah, I think though what's important to understand, again, in this context, remember when we do a word study, you always look for, was the word used elsewhere in the immediate context? That's where you first look, right? If you're trying to understand. And if we do that, notice we have here, he mentions the elect in verse 22. The elect who are in the tribulation. Okay. The word elect is chosen ones, I think, right? If we go to let me look at the Greek text here, verse 22. The called out ones here. The chosen, those who are called. So the called out ones, the chosen ones in those days, what days? The days of the tribulation in verse 22. And then later he refers to the elect in verse 24. That false prophets will arise again when? In the tribulation, so it's possible to mislead even the elect. Well, these must be the elect who are alive in the tribulation, the Christians who are in the tribulation, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so now immediately after the tribulation, he refers to the elect. I think it's Christians in the tribulation period, myself. Okay.
We'll find it later.
What's that?
we will know it later.
Yeah, we'll know the real answer later. But I think the elect. I'll just write it here explicitly. I believe that it refers to believers who are alive at the second coming, based on references to them in verses 21 and 24. Okay, the immediate context.
They're the one who have been left by the rapture.
I don't think it's a reference to the rapture, because again, in this context, he doesn't mention another category when he says that his elect will be gathered. So I believe, the nearest reference is the elect he's spoken of just a few verses earlier, which are believers, chosen ones who were alive in the days of the tribulation. So again, that's how I would interpret verse 31 based on the context here. Okay, to say that it's the whole church is a possibility, but I think it ignores the fact that he's already referred to the elect 2 other times in this time period in this passage. But there's also one other thing that comes up when people study this passage. We could read, let's see, Joshua, if you're there, and if you haven't fallen asleep on us from being up all night, can you read verses 32 to 35, 36? Are you with us, brother? Joshua?
Yes, Pastor Tim. 32 to
Okay.
36.
Yeah, can
Change
you read
the
32
Changing
to,
diapers.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of
Okay,
that day, oh,
sorry, go ahead. You can go ahead.
but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone.
Great. I just had Joshua read this because verse 34 is an interesting statement that has brought up a lot of discussion, and that is, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass until all these things take place. Well, there's been a big discussion. Well, what did he mean there? What generation? What are they talking about? Okay. And there's a few different views. I just wanted you to be aware of this in case you come across this when you're studying. There's probably 5 or 6 different opinions, but I think the 3 most common are that it either refers to just the Jews, that the Jews will still be alive, the race of Israel, nation of Israel will still be in existence, so that the generation, the Jews will not pass away until these things take place. Another is the generation of the tribulation. Those who go through the tribulation period will experience it, and that generation will not pass away until it happens. And then there's a third, that it's the generation in the days of Jesus, basically the disciples' generation, that they will see all these events. And by the way, if you're familiar with the view called the preterists, anyone recognize that term? Preterism? Those are the
First
people.
time,
What's that?
first time hearing that term. Me.
Okay. Well, these guys believe that that all these events spoken of here are actually all of it took place, was fulfilled in 70 AD. They believe that the book of Revelation took place in 70 AD. Now they have to take a more figurative interpretation to say that, but their view is that basically that this has already happened. And I'm not going to get into, we'll talk a little more about it later when we discuss the different views, but so they would say this generation means the disciples' generation, but that can't be the case. All right. And why is that? What's one simple reason that we know that these events have not yet happened?
Because the Lord said that, let the readers.
heaven and earth.
Yeah, there's all these cataclysmic events, but they could say, well, there's been natural disasters and blah, blah, blah. But there's one simple answer, I believe, to why we know this has not yet happened. And it's in verse 30.
Son of Man coming.
Yeah, Jesus is not back yet. Right? Unless I missed something. Did you guys miss it? Anyone seen Jesus lately? I mean, he hasn't returned.
In Davao.
No, Kibuloy.
Well, yeah, here we go. Okay. Okay, maybe he's a preterist. I don't know. But, you know, seriously, Son of Man has not taken place. So this generation can't refer to the specific generation of the disciples. Okay. But that is a view that is held by some. Generation of those in the tribulation, it could be that. I actually believe that it's just referring to the fact the Jews, that this generation of people, the Jews, are referenced because the word can be a general reference to a group of people. Okay, I think it refers to the Jews for a couple of reasons, and this is not something I would die on, this hill I would die on, but if you go through the passage, it's very Jewish. Look at all the references here to things in relationship to Israel. I mean, first, obviously, is they're talking about the temple. They're in the Mount of Olives. But notice, I am the Christ. Okay, that's a Greek translation of the Jewish term, the Messiah. The gospel of the kingdom. All right, that's a Jewish term. The abomination of desolation spoken of in Daniel. All right, that's going to take place in the temple. Then notice he says, those who are in Judea must flee. He didn't say those everywhere on the earth must flee. He said specifically in reference to Judea. And then he talks about a Sabbath in verse 20. And then in verse 23, here is the Christ, the Messiah, false Christs, false prophets. Those are Jewish terms oriented toward the Jew. And then, of course, the Son of Man. That's a Jewish expression coming from, again, the book of Daniel. Verse 30, the Son of Man. Verse 30, the Son of Man. It seems to have a sort of Jewish-centric focus here. And I think it's significant because remember, the second coming, the Messiah will establish his reign in Jerusalem in fulfillment of promises made to the nation of Israel. So to me, this generation, it makes the most sense to be in reference to the nation of Israel, the Jewish people. But I've seen good arguments for at least the second view about the tribulation. This third view is no good argument, in my opinion, because Jesus hasn't returned. There's a couple other views that are interesting. I didn't want to go through all of them with you, but just at least wanted you to be aware, because that's a question that often comes up when you're studying Matthew chapter 24. And then even after verse 34, notice again, the coming of the Son of Man will be like the days of Noah. And so there's this Jewish-centric focus here in this chapter. Okay. All right. Again, we covered a lot of information there in this passage, but you guys have any questions or comments before we finish up today? I hope that was helpful, at least maybe to get you thinking a little bit about possible understanding of this important chapter. This is one of the few prophetic texts we have in the Gospels where Jesus actually walks through specific future events. So it's an important passage to consider when we're talking about the end times. Any questions or comments?
No, Pastor Tim.
No more, Pastor Tim. Thank you for enlightening us in this whole chapter. especially the coming of Christ. In this event specific, especially.
Yeah, certainly. Well, next week is American holiday Thanksgiving, so I'm going to be with my family at this time. So we won't be having the class next week, but we will, Lord willing, the following week, which will be actually December. December
Vacation.
3rd, right? Yeah, December 3rd will be our next class. So my hope is to get to work on the assignments you guys have turned in. So I would ask you to catch up on those. And then also too, I need to talk to you guys, and we'll discuss this next time, because we're actually, this is actual module. Though we're doing it online, Taya, because this is part of the formal certificate program, we need to also collect tuition for this module to participate. So I need to talk to Pastor Sean about the details of that. And if there's any financial concerns with COVID and all of that, we totally understand. Just let me know, and we have scholarships available. But Taya would like to, because this is an actual course that is part of a certificate program, that if you're taking it, needs to be there needs to be tuition. I think it's 2,000 or 2,500 pesos, something like that. But again, don't let that be a hindrance to you. If money's an issue, we can work that out. Just let me know. But I'm just giving you a heads up, to let you know now. We'll talk more details about it later. But I should have brought this up at the beginning of the course, but I didn't even think about it because we're doing everything online. So it's a little different than how we've done this before. But I'll give you more details later. Don't worry about it now. I'm just giving you the information. But so we won't meet next Friday, but we'll meet, Lord willing, the Friday after that, and finally get to the key passages in Revelation. Talk about that together. But try to take, before Christmas comes, take advantage of this time where I'm not giving you new assignments. Take advantage of it to get the old ones done. Okay?
Pastor Tim.
Yes. Okay, and I'm always available too, guys. If you need help on any of them, or just message me, let me know what you need, and I'll be glad to help. Okay.
Okay, Pastor Tim. Thank you, Pastor Tim.
So,
All right.